She had 32 cents to her name, a dying car battery, and nowhere to go. Forced to seek shelter in a rotting, forgotten cabin, Chloe thought her life was over. She didn't know the cracked floorboards beneath her freezing body were hiding a secret that would change history. The dashboard lights of the 2008 Honda Civic flickered one final time before the engine gave a pathetic cough and died. Chloe Harper gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the heavy Appalachian silence swallowed the hum of the heater. Outside, a freezing rain had begun to fall, turning the winding, unlit stretch of North Carolina's Route 116 into a slick ribbon of black ice. She was completely, utterly alone. At 32 years old, Chloe had spent the last decade building a life that was dismantled in a matter of months. Her ex-husband, Derek Mitchell, hadn't just broken her heart. He had weaponized the legal system to obliterate her existence. A charismatic corporate lawyer with a vindictive streak, Derek had buried her in frivolous lawsuits after the divorce, drained their joint accounts before she could secure a lawyer, and leveraged his connections to force her out of the small bakery business she had poured her soul into. When the bank foreclosed on her home 3 days ago, Chloe had packed her life into 2 duffel bags and started driving. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get as far away from Derek's reach as possible. Now, staring through a windshield rapidly accumulating frost, she realized she might not make it through the night. Chloe pulled out her phone. No service. The battery was at 4%. The biting cold was already seeping through the rusted floorboards of the Civic. She was wearing a thin fleece jacket, jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. The temperature was projected to drop into the low teens. Staying in the metal tomb of her car meant freezing to death by morning. Grabbing her heavy-duty flashlight and the smaller of her 2 bags, Chloe stepped out into the biting wind. The sleet hit her face like shards of glass. She swept the beam of her flashlight across the tree line. The dense pines looked like jagged teeth against the dark sky. Then, just a few yards ahead, she saw it. A break in the trees, marked by 2 crumbling stone pillars. It was an old logging road, heavily overgrown with briars and choked with fallen branches. But it was a path, and paths usually led to shelter. Desperation is a powerful motivator. Chloe plunged into the woods. The hike was agonizing. Briars tore at her jeans, scratching her legs. Mud sucked at her shoes, threatening to pull them off with every step. The flashlight beam trembled in her shaking hands, casting long, monstrous shadows through the skeletal trees. She walked for what felt like hours, though her phone told her it had only been 40 minutes. Her toes were completely numb, and a dangerous warm lethargy was beginning to creep into her limbs, the first stage of severe hypothermia. Just as she was about to collapse against the trunk of a massive oak, the trees parted. Sitting in a small, sunken clearing was a structure. It wasn't a house, and it wasn't the quaint log cabin you'd see on a postcard. It was a decaying, sagging shack built from heavy timber and corrugated tin. The roof bowed heavily in the center, weighed down by years of accumulated pine needles and rot. The windows were either shattered or boarded up with rotting planks. It looked like it hadn't seen a living soul since the 1980s. Chloe dragged herself to the front porch. The wooden steps groaned in protest beneath her weight. She reached for the rusted iron doorknob. It wouldn't turn. Panic flared in her chest. She stepped back, aimed her shoulder at the wood near the lock, and threw her entire body weight against the door. The ancient wood splintered, and the door burst inward, sending Chloe sprawling onto a dust-caked floor. The smell hit her instantly. Musty, damp wood, animal droppings, and the unmistakable scent of deep, undisturbed decay. She quickly scrambled to her feet and swept the flashlight around the room. It was a single, large space. A rusted potbelly stove sat in the center. In the corner was a decaying mattress on a rusted iron frame. A collapsed wooden table and a few overturned chairs were scattered near a makeshift kitchen area. It was a nightmare, but it had walls and a roof that mostly held back the sleet. Chloe pushed the broken door shut, wedging one of the heavy, overturned chairs against the knob to keep the howling wind out. She moved to the center of the room, near the stove. There was no firewood, only a pile of damp, rotting magazines and old trash. She didn't have matches anyway. She dragged the cleanest corner of the moldy mattress off the bed frame and pulled it near the stove, creating a small barrier against the drafts coming through the floorboards. She curled into a tight ball, zipping her duffel bag and using it as a pillow. As she lay there in the pitch black, the sheer weight of her situation crashed down on her. The tears came, hot and fast. She cried for her bakery, for her stolen savings, for the absolute cruelty of Derek, and for the pathetic reality of sleeping on a rotting floor in an abandoned cabin. Every creak of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every rustle of mice in the walls set her heart racing. She spent the night drifting in and out of consciousness, shivering violently, trapped in feverish nightmares of Derek finding her. She didn't know who had built this cabin or why it had been left to rot. But as she pressed her ear against the cold wooden floor, trying to find a comfortable position, she noticed something strange. The wind was howling outside, but she could feel a steady, almost warm draft of air hitting the side of her face. It wasn't coming from the walls or the windows. It was coming from directly beneath her. Chloe woke to a pale, grey light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Her body felt stiff, as if her joints had been poured full of concrete overnight. Every breath she took plumed in the freezing air of the cabin. But she was alive. She sat up, rubbing her arms furiously to generate some heat. In the harsh light of day, the cabin looked even more decrepit. Cobwebs hung like thick grey curtains from the rafters. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted tin cans, and old, decayed boots. Her mouth was desperately dry. She grabbed an old, relatively clean coffee tin from the kitchen counter, wiped it out with her sleeve, and set it outside the broken door to catch the freezing rain that was still steadily falling. While she waited for water to collect, her mind went back to the anomaly she had noticed during the night. The draft. She walked over to the spot where she had slept, right next to the rusted pot-belly stove. The floorboards here were green, rough-hewn planks of oak. She dropped to her knees and ran her bare hands over the wood. There it was again, a distinct, steady flow of air, completely different in temperature and scent from the damp chill of the cabin. It smelled dry, metallic, and incredibly old. Chloe brushed away a thick layer of dust, dead leaves, and mouse droppings. She traced the edges of the boards. 3 of the planks were shorter than the rest. They didn't span the length of the room. They ended abruptly about 4 feet from the stove. She cleared away more dirt, her fingernails scraping against hard iron. Hinges. 2 massive, blackened iron hinges were set flush into the floorboards, expertly recessed so they wouldn't be noticed unless you were looking for them. Opposite the hinges was a small, circular indentation in the wood. Chloe dug her fingers into the indentation and found an iron pull ring folded flat into the wood. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This wasn't just a missing floorboard. It was a heavy, concealed trapdoor. "Okay," Chloe whispered to herself, the sound of her own voice startling her in the silent cabin. Let's see what you're hiding. She gripped the rusted iron ring. She planted her feet, braced her back, and pulled with everything she had. The trapdoor didn't budge. Decades of rust and warped wood held it firmly in place. She stood up and scoured the cabin for leverage. In the kitchen area, she found a heavy, rusted iron fire poker buried under a pile of debris. She brought it back, wedged the flattened tip under the edge of the trapdoor near the ring, and pushed down on the handle with all her weight. With a sound like a gunshot, the rusted seal broke. Wood splintered, the iron hinges shrieked a deafening metallic scream, and the heavy door popped open. Chloe fell backward, panting. A rush of stale air plumed out of the dark rectangular hole, carrying the distinct scent of old paper, engine oil, and damp earth. She scrambled forward, grabbing her flashlight, and pointed the beam downward. It wasn't a crawl space, it was a staircase. Sturdy, thick wooden steps led down into absolute blackness. The walls of the stairwell were lined with brick, not dirt. This was not a makeshift root cellar for storing potatoes. This was a deliberate, engineered bunker. A primal instinct told her to close the door, back away, and walk out of the woods. People didn't build Hadul. Hidden bunkers in the middle of nowhere, unless they had something valuable to hide, or something dangerous to keep secret. But Chloe had 32 cents in her pocket, and nowhere to go. If there were blankets, canned food, or anything she could sell down there, she had to take the risk. She clicked her flashlight to its brightest setting and began the descent. The stairs groaned but held her weight. She counted 12 steps before her boots hit a solid, concrete floor. She swept the beam of light around the room, her breath catching in her throat. The cellar was roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, and it was immaculately dry. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden desk, piled high with leather-bound ledgers, rusted compasses, and maps that had curled at the edges. Against the far wall were stacks of wooden crates. Some were marked with faded military stencils, others were blank. Chloe walked slowly toward the desk. She wiped a thick layer of dust off the top ledger and opened it. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and written in faded blue ink. October 14th, 1978. Cargo secured from the coastal drop. The local authorities are blind as ever. Sheriff Brody took his usual cut and turned his cruisers away from Route 116. Transferring the assets to the reserve tomorrow. Chloe frowned. Assets. Coastal drop. She flipped through the pages. They were filled with coordinates, dates, and massive monetary figures. Tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, meticulously tracked over decades. The name at the front of the book was signed boldly, Alfred Whitman. She recognized that name. While living in Charlotte, she had watched a local true crime documentary about the Whitman Syndicate, a massive smuggling ring that operated off the North Carolina coast in the 70s and 80s, moving untraceable contraband and laundering millions. Alfred Whitman, the alleged kingpin, had vanished in 1989 before the FBI could indict him. The legend was that he took his fortune with him. Chloe stepped away from the desk, her flashlight trembling. She aimed the beam at the dark corner of the room behind the wooden crates. Sitting there, covered in a heavy canvas tarp, was a massive object. Chloe walked over and yanked the tarp away. A cloud of dust plumed into the air, revealing a colossal dark green steel safe. It stood 5 feet tall, boasting a heavy brass combination dial and an ornate spinning handle. It looked impenetrable. But it wasn't the safe that made Chloe drop to her knees. Resting on top of the safe was a distressed leather satchel. The leather was dry-rotted and cracked. The buckles were undone. Chloe reached up and carefully pulled the satchel down to the floor. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she opened the main flap. Inside, wrapped in brittle rubber bands that snapped as soon as she touched them, were stacks of cash. Hundreds of them. But they weren't modern bills. They were old Series $100 bills, the kind with the smaller portraits, perfectly preserved in the dry, airtight cellar. Beneath them were bundles of 50s and what looked like stacks of bearer bonds. Chloe pulled out a stack of hundreds and stared at it. She thumbed through the bills. It was real. It was undeniably real. Just in this bag alone, there had to be over $50,000. The safe itself was the size of a refrigerator. If the bag was just the overflow, what was inside the steel vault? A hysterical, breathless laugh escaped her lips. Yesterday, she was begging a debt collector for a 3-day extension. Today, she was holding more money than she had ever seen in her life. This was her way out. This was her revenge against Derek. This was a new life, handed to her from the ghost of Alfred Whitman. She hurriedly began stuffing the bundles of cash into her jacket pockets, desperate to secure the money before she woke up from what had to be a dream. As she reached into the bottom of the satchel to grab the last bundle, her flashlight beam slipped, illuminating the dusty concrete floor directly next to the heavy steel safe. Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face, and the ambient chill of the cellar suddenly felt like plunging into ice water. There, stamped clearly in the decades-old dust, was a footprint. It wasn't a decayed 80-year-old mark. The edges of the dust were sharp, crisp, and undisturbed. It was the heavy tread of a modern tactical boot, and it was pointed directly at the safe. She wasn't the first person to find this room, and judging by the fact that the dust hadn't settled back over the print, whoever made it had been down here very, very recently. Suddenly, the heavy wooden floorboards in the cabin above her head creaked. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the trapdoor. Someone had just walked inside. Chloe instantly killed her flashlight, plunging the cellar back into an inky, suffocating blackness. She clamped a hand over her own mouth, desperately trying to quiet the ragged sound of her breathing. Above her, the heavy floorboards groaned under the weight of someone walking with purpose. Dust sifted down through the cracks in the ceiling, falling onto her face like snow. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, clutching the bundles of cash to her chest, and wedged herself into the narrow, damp gap between the stack of wooden crates and the cold brick wall. She pulled her knees to her chin, making herself as small as humanly possible. The rusted hinges of the trapdoor shrieked above. A blinding shaft of white light pierced the darkness, slicing down the wooden staircase. The beam swept across the concrete floor, illuminating the swirling dust motes. Then came the heavy thud of boots descending the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps. Chloe held her breath until her lungs burned. The intruder reached the bottom. The tactical flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the wooden desk, the faded maps, and finally, the colossal steel safe. In the harsh backscatter of the light, Chloe caught a glimpse of the man. He was tall and heavily built, wearing a dark green tactical jacket. But it was the glint of silver on his belt that made Chloe's blood run cold. A sheriff's badge. Well, well, a deep, gravelly voice echoed off the brick walls. Looks like the little bird from the Honda Civic found the worm. It was Deputy Clayton Briggs. Chloe didn't know his name yet, but she recognized the uniform from the true crime documentary she'd watched years ago in Charlotte. The documentary had mentioned that Sheriff Brody, the man named in Alfred Whitman's ledger, had kept his operation entirely within the family. Decades later, his descendants were still wearing the badge, and still quietly patrolling Route 116, waiting for the day someone figured out how to crack Whitman's vault. Deputy Briggs stepped closer to the safe. He saw the disturbed dust. He saw the dry, rotted leather satchel resting on the floor, its flaps thrown open, completely empty. Chloe could hear the leather of his gun holster creak as he unclasped it. The metallic snick of a 9mm handgun, chambering a round, sounded as loud as a cannon in the confined space. "I saw your car dead on the highway, lady," Briggs called out, his voice dangerously calm. He began to pace the room, sweeping his flashlight in slow, deliberate arcs. Ran the plates. Chloe Harper. Foreclosed property, no active credit cards, no missing persons report. Nobody in the world knows you're out here. You froze to death in the woods. That's what the coroner's report is going to say. Now you can step out and make this quick, or I can hunt you around this room. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. Tears of pure terror leaked down her cheeks. He was right. Derek had isolated her so thoroughly that if she vanished into these woods, not a single soul would come looking for her. Briggs would shoot her, bury her in this cellar, and take the money she had just stuffed into her pockets. The flashlight beam danced across the edge of the crates, inches from Chloe's face. She felt the heavy iron fire poker she had brought down with her, still resting against her thigh. It was her only chance. Briggs took another step, his heavy boot crunching on a piece of broken glass. "Suit yourself." He lunged around the corner of the crates, leading with his gun. But Chloe was already moving, using every ounce of adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't retreat. She attacked. She swung the heavy iron fire poker blindly into the darkness. A sickening crunch echoed through the cellar as the iron connected hard with Briggs's wrist. He roared in pain, dropping the flashlight. The heavy metal cylinder hit the concrete and rolled, casting wild, spinning shadows across the walls. The gun fired into the ceiling. Bang! Deafening Chloe, leaving a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Brick dust showered down on them. Briggs lunged in the dark, his massive hands blindly grabbing for her. He caught the fabric of her fleece jacket, yanking her violently forward. Chloe screamed, thrashing wildly. She dropped the iron poker and drove her knee upward, catching him squarely in the stomach. As he doubled over, gasping for air, Chloe shoved him with both hands. Briggs stumbled backward. His heel caught the edge of the heavy leather satchel on the floor. He pitched backward, flailing, and the back of his skull collided with the solid steel edge of the massive Whitman safe. He crumpled to the floor like a sack of stones. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by Chloe's hyperventilating gasps. She scrambled on her hands and knees, snatching the tactical flashlight from the floor. She pointed the beam at Briggs. He was unconscious, a dark pool of blood beginning to form on the concrete beneath his head. He wasn't dead. His chest was rising and falling in shallow breaths, but he was out cold. Chloe didn't waste a single second. She snatched his dropped 9mm handgun, shoving it into her waistband. She sprinted up the wooden stairs, her legs burning, tearing through the trapdoor. She threw the heavy oak planks shut. With frantic, desperate strength, she grabbed the edge of the rusted cast-iron pot-belly stove. It had to weigh over 300 pounds, but terror is a miraculous fuel. Screaming with exertion, she dragged the stove across the floorboards until it rested squarely over the center of the trapdoor. She then kicked the overturned table on top of it, creating a barricade of sheer weight. Briggs was trapped in his own treasure vault. Chloe grabbed her duffel bag, kicked open the broken front door, and ran out into the freezing, relentless sleet. The hike back to the highway was a blur of hypothermic agony and pure, unadulterated survival instinct. The bundles of vintage cash in her pockets felt like a heavy armor against the cold. When she finally burst through the tree line onto Route 116, a massive logging truck was barreling down the icy asphalt. Chloe stood dead in the center of the lane, waving her arms wildly. The driver, a burly man named Alfred Penning, slammed on his air brakes, his rig skidding to a halt mere feet from her. He took one look at her blue lips and blood-stained hands, threw open the passenger door, and cranked the heater to the max. He drove her straight to a motel in the small town of Silver. Once safely locked in a cheap, peeling motel room, Chloe dumped the contents of her jacket onto the bed. $84,000 in pristine, untraceable vintage bills. She took a hot shower, bought a burner phone from the gas station next door, and began to formulate a plan. She couldn't go to the local authorities. If Briggs was corrupt, the whole department might be compromised. They would confiscate the money, silence her, and release Briggs. She needed leverage, and she needed distance. Over the next month, Chloe vanished into the bustling anonymity of New York City. She used a fraction of the cash to hire Jonathan Weaver, a high-profile asset recovery attorney who specialized in offshore accounts and blind trusts. She didn't tell him everything, only that she had a lead on a massive abandoned asset in North Carolina. Through a labyrinth of shell companies set up by Weaver, Chloe legally purchased the 50 acres of North Carolina woodland containing the abandoned cabin. She paid $40,000 in cash to the county clerk's office, legally taking ownership of the land and everything buried beneath it. Once the deed was securely in her name, she hired a private, heavily armed excavation crew out of Atlanta. When the crew arrived at the cabin 3 weeks later, they found Deputy Clayton Briggs gone. He had eventually managed to dig his way out through the dirt wall of the cellar, abandoning his badge and fleeing the state to avoid the inevitable wrath of whatever authorities found him. But he had left the safe behind. Under the watchful eye of Jonathan Weaver and a team of private security, a safecracker worked for 14 hours on the massive green vault. When the heavy steel door finally swung open, the crew fell entirely silent. It wasn't filled with paper money. It was stacked floor to ceiling with gold bullion. Alfred Whitman hadn't just hoarded cash. He had converted his smuggling empire into heavy, untraceable gold. The total appraisal came out to just over $4.2 million. Because Chloe legally owned the land, and because the statute of limitations on Whitman's alleged crimes had long since expired without a single conviction, the gold was declared legally abandoned property. It belonged entirely to the landowner. It belonged to Chloe. 6 months later, Derek Mitchell was sitting in his corner office in downtown Charlotte, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, when his secretary nervously handed him a thick manila envelope. Derek tore it open. It was a notice of aggressive, hostile takeover. A massive anonymous holding company based in New York had systematically bought up the debt of his boutique law firm. They had acquired his mortgages, leveraged his outstanding loans, and were now initiating a brutal, unyielding foreclosure on his firm, his penthouse, and his assets. Attached to the legal documents was a single glossy photograph. It was a picture of a stunning, state-of-the-art bakery in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The sign above the door read, "The Gilded Crumb." Standing in front of the bakery, wearing a tailored designer suit and a smile that could cut glass, was Chloe Harper. She hadn't just survived the freezing woods. She had weaponized the ghosts of the past to build an empire. Derek had stripped her of 32 cents and a dying car. She had returned with the weight of a millionaire's vengeance. Chloe Harper was never going to be cold, broke, or afraid ever again. If Chloe's incredible journey from a freezing, abandoned cabin to a multi-million-dollar bakery empire kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on these thrilling, true-life survival stories. Share this video with a friend who loves a satisfying plot twist, and drop a comment below letting us know what you would do if you found a hidden bunker.